The Salton Sea is California's largest lake and is one of the country's biggest environmental disasters. Historically, the lake has had a wide range of different kinds of problems. In the past, algae blooms have killed off millions of fish, while diseases have killed and sickened thousands of birds. A rise in the Salton Sea's elevation has previously flooded out communities and led to the destruction of attractions such as yacht clubs. Now, ongoing decreases in the size of the lake, due to reduced inflows, are causing new problems. As the Salton Sea shrinks, salinity rises, making the lake inhospitable to most fish. This loss is heavily affecting birds who consume these fish during their migrations over the Salton Sea. The growing amount of lake bed, called playa, is also releasing toxic dust into the region. This dust is causing severe health issues to people in the region. These health issues are leading to the death of children, who are some of the most affected. After these tremendous and horrific problems occurred, and continue to occur at the Salton Sea, I wondered, what predictions were made about the Salton Sea? What predictions were wrong? Were all the problems with the Salton Sea anticipated? After reviewing sources from different decades that discuss the future of the Salton Sea, it becomes clear that predictions change as fast as the elevation of the lake itself. From 1905 to 1907, a irrigation breach redirected the entire Colorado River to flow into a low spot known as the Salton Sink. Historically, the Colorado River has naturally changed its direction to flow into this low spot many times before creating lakes. However, because people lost control of the river for these 2 years, the Salton Sea has always been seen as a man-made accident. From as early as 1907 to sometime before 1917, people thought that the Salton Sea would evaporate away. After all, the irrigation breach that created the lake was repaired in 1907, and the lake had no major source of water to sustain it. In 1909, the federal government expanded the Native American Torres Martinez Reservation to include 10,000 acres of land that was still underwater due to the assumption that the lake would dry up by the 1920s. A study of the Salton Sea in 1914 predicted that the lake would no longer be around by 1924, or more likely by 1932. However, by 1917, a geographical review of the Salton Sea understood that the Salton Sea would, in fact, continue to exist thanks to local agricultural runoff. In 1927, another prediction about the elevation of the lake was created by the United States Geological Survey. They thought that the lake would stabilize between 223 and 226 feet below sea level. With this estimate, all land that was below 220 feet in 1928 was removed from public entry. Fast forward over 30 years later, and the Imperial Irrigation District, or IID for short, in the early 1960s states there was no way to predict the elevation of the Salton Sea. In 1964, an estimate of the elevation of the Salton Sea was at about negative 231 feet. That's a 5-foot drop in elevation from the maximum lake level from the prediction made 37 years prior. The first recording of a concern for the increasing salinity in the Salton Sea that I found was in 1961 by the California Department of Fish and Game. They predicted that the lake would become inhospitable to fish from increased salinity sometime between 1980 and 1990. A book titled Imperial Valley, published in 1968, later predicted the lake would reach this salinity as soon as 1972. 4 years after the book was published, as early as the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the Bureau of Reclamation and the state of California worked together to create study and environmental impact statement regarding salinity control. The small book titled The Salton Sea Recreation Guide, published in 1964, however, gives a very optimistic view of the future of the lake. This guide discusses how the lake became inhospitable to freshwater fish from a rise in salinity, but does not mention a concern about the lake eventually becoming too salty for saltwater fish too. The book went as far to say, quote, "While the shoreline undoubtedly will be subject to minor changes from year to year, Salton Sea is an attractive recreational region that will be enjoyed for many decades to come. Rising or falling water will have no effect on the boating, the skiing, or the exploring. At some point in the future, when the available farmland has been reclaimed around this vast inland sea, relative stability will occur. Yes, Salton Sea is a permanent part of Southern California's recreation picture. It will carry an ever more important role as the deserts bloom with the inevitable prosperity." A major prediction about the future of the Salton Sea mentioned in this old book, though, seems to have most certainly come true, unfortunately, for the worse. This guide said, quote, "Records prove that a single heavy storm can raise Salton Sea's surface elevation by 1.5 feet. If 2 or more storms occur in 1 year, the sea can rise dramatically." Just 12 years after this guide was written, Tropical Storm Kathleen followed by above average rainfall for the next 7 years. Along with increased agricultural runoff and increased flows from Mexico and Tropical Storm Doreen in 1977, altogether raised the lake dramatically to the point communities and yacht clubs along the shore were severely flooded. In other words, the estimate in the guidebook that 2 storms could raise the lake drastically seemed to have come true, This rise in the lake's elevation, that started in the 1960s, made the salinity of the lake appear stable. This helped postpone efforts to stabilize the salinity of the lake, and would only become more of a concern again in the 1980s, when salinity began to have damaged the sport fishery at the lake. Since at least 1971, new problems began to occur at the lake. These problems were not predicted in any sources that I found. Algae blooms began to occur, creating unclear water and creating anoxic conditions. Barnacles became annoying to boaters and painful to bathers. A red tide began to occur that would kill marine life. A sulfuric odor also began to develop that has been described as a rotten egg smell. By this year, predictions were made that rising salinity and nutrient pollution were a threat to survival of the fish in the lake. At this point, the Salton Sea was the largest fishery in a lake in the southwestern United States. Another prediction was made that increasing salinity could destroy the sea's utility as a sport fishery, waterfowl habitat, and water contact activity resource as early as 1975. During this time, a dike was being pushed as the solution to stabilize salinity problems. Plans for a dike in a joint study with the state and federal government were completed, suggesting a dike the size of 50 square miles. It was thought that this impound basin would work for 100 years. However, in 1997, Phil Gruenberg, who was the executive officer of the California Regional Water Quality Control Board, said that building of a dike 40 to 50 square miles would be too small to control salinity. Mr. Gruenberg suggested that the dike would need to be closer to 125 square miles due to increases in salinity. Since the 1980s, large fish die-offs began to occur. The dead fish were said to have covered an area the size of 2 soccer fields. This was the start of another issue that was not foretold from my research. In 1992, 150,000 birds, called eared grebes, died and littered the shores of the lake. 2 years later, another die-off of 20,000 of these birds occurred. The reason for these 2 die-offs may not be completely understood. However, in 1996, the death of 15,000 pelicans is thought to have occurred due to type C avian botulism. Botulism grew in the blocked intestines of tilapia due to Vibrio infection, and birds would eat these contaminated fish. Of these 15,000 pelicans, over 1,000 were endangered brown pelicans. This event also led to the death of an estimated 15 to 20% of the entire western population of white pelicans. Other water birds were also killed by this disease. In the late 1990s, tilapia became the dominant fish in the Salton Sea. Tilapia populations actually grew to the point of overpopulating the lake, thanks to rising salinity, decreasing the population of other fish. Diseases in fish flourished due to this overpopulation and caused many diseases to transmit from the infected fish to birds. Bird-to-bird diseases have also caused die-offs at the Salton Sea in the past. Newcastle disease killed a colony of a bird called cormorants in 1997. R. Wayne Hardy, who was the group leader of energy and environmental analysis for the Los Alamos National Laboratory, reported that the sea could not support most fish when the lake reaches a salinity of 60 parts per thousand. This would occur around the year 2012. In 1997, a die-off of fish 3 miles long occurred, followed by another die-off in the summer of 1998, with a total of 500,000 fish. On August 4th of 99, 76 million tilapia died and were spread across the North Shore 10 miles long and 3 miles wide. Summer die-offs were later explained as occurring due to multiple factors leading to oxygen depletion in the water. The accepted scientific explanation of summer fish die-offs involves the oxygen-depleting combination of sun and salt. Salt water carries less oxygen than fresh water. Hot water carries less oxygen than cool water. When the sea's increasingly briny water heats up in summer temperatures that can reach 125 degrees Fahrenheit, fish begin to suffocate. When a summer wind churns up the nutrients, algae blooms, sometimes turned an entire end of the lake green within a day. The decaying algae also consumes more of the water's oxygen. An article from the New York Times in 2002 reports that the Salton Sea would not be able to support life starting around the years of 2030-2040 without water diversions from the surrounding farm communities. However, the article also predicted that water diversions would lead to the lake becoming inhospitable to life by 2007. In 2012, the Salton Sea was smelled more than 150 miles away in Palmdale and Lancaster. A fish die-off in early September of that year with strong storms likely stirred up the water, causing the stench. Another series of stench events occurred also in 2015, resulting in the nearby Coachella Valley having 5 odor advisories in October that year. Since about 2018, the salinity of the Salton Sea has increased to 3 times that of the ocean. This extreme salinity has stopped the tilapia from reproducing and is killing off invertebrates such as pileworms. Birds who depend on these 2 species, such as eared grebe, double-crested cormorant, and American white pelican have mostly vanished from the lake. This is concerning because the eared grebe, for example, used to use the lake as a major stopover during their migrations. Audubon estimated that 90% of all eared grebes used to visit the Salton Sea at some point during the year. In 2000s, there were an estimated 3.5 million birds at the lake, while in the fall and winter of 2017 and 2018, only 3 were seen. In 2022, a panel at the University of Santa Cruz released a report that said that after 2018, inflow of water into the Salton Sea was reduced to a third and salinity rose to 62,927 parts per million. This was a result of the Quantification Settlement Agreement, which was a water transfer deal that went through in 2003. The panel predicts that a salinity of around 70,000 parts per million is the point of which the in-sea food webs that support avian wildlife are likely to collapse. I could not find a year of when this is predicted to occur. After reviewing the long history of predictions about the future of the Salton Sea, it becomes clear that many of them were wrong. Many predictions on when, or at what elevation, the lake would stabilize at were flawed. Estimates of when the Salton Sea would no longer be able to support fish, and the collapse of its ecosystem, were off. That mid-century optimism that the Salton Sea's recreation would be sustainable was a faulty dream. The prediction of how large a dike would need to be to stabilize salinity changed dramatically over only a few decades. It should be noted, though, that the Salton Sea is a very large, complex system. For example, unpredictable storms and relatively quick changes of inflow can make the salinity and elevation rise and fall rapidly. Estimates from the last mid-century could not foresee the water transfer deal in 2003. After all, the concern in the past was about too much water flowing into the lake that was causing severe flooding. Now concern has completely changed to worrying about not enough water flowing into the lake. This is resulting in the exposure of toxic playa and the destruction of the Salton Sea's fishery for migrating birds. Despite the long history of issues the Salton Sea has, and the faulty predictions of the Salton Sea's future, action is needed now more than ever to create a Salton Sea that is no longer an environmental disaster,